Our scripture lesson today comes from the most familiar passage of Easter Sunday, and that's Matthew chapter 28. I've put the words up on the overhead so that you can read it along with me as we begin our study together. After the Sabbath, at dawn on the first day of the... When I say we could read it together, that means out loud. Didn't know if you understood that part of it or not. I have to be so specific with my instructions. After the Sabbath, at dawn on the first day of the week, Mary Magdalene and the other Mary went to look at the tomb. There was a violent earthquake, for an angel of the Lord came down from heaven, and going to the tomb, rolled back the stone and sat on it. His appearance was like lightning, and his clothes were white as snow. The guards were so afraid of him that they shook and became like dead men. The angel said to the women, "Do not be afraid, for I know that you are looking for Jesus who was crucified. He is not here, he has risen just as he said. Come and see the place where he lay. Then go quickly and tell his disciples, he has risen from the dead and has gone ahead of you into Galilee. There you will see him. Now I have told you." So the women hurried away from the tomb, afraid yet filled with joy, and ran to tell his disciples. You know, in some churches, I'm glad we're not one of them, but in some churches people get all, gussied up for Easter, and all the little children. I don't remember, but I've seen the pictures of mom getting us all dressed up, in a suit and tie, and, just misery when you're 3, 4, 5 years old. And kind of like I'm feeling with this tie now, but it's Easter and I have to prove to you once a year that I have a tie. So I know I'm a real preacher. I have at least one tie. But I heard of a little boy who was in the back seat of the car on his way Easter Sunday, and they'd gotten him new shoes, and they were pinching his feet, and he had a little suit jacket on, and he had a necktie on his neck, and he wanted to be home playing with his Easter gifts and, looking at Easter eggs and eating his chocolate bunny, and he's back in the back seat. He says, "I just don't know why we have to go to church this Easter. Anyway, they keep telling the same story, and it keeps turning out the same way." Well, good. I'm glad it does, right? Aren't you glad the same old story ends the same way? He's alive. And that's the fact of the resurrection. Verse 6, he has risen just as he said. One of the greatest messages that anybody was ever given. He is not here. He is risen just as he said. What we celebrate today is not a myth. What we celebrate today is not a fable. We're celebrating historic fact. I have talked through my years with a lot of skeptics and a lot of cynics. I have never yet met anybody who denies that Jesus actually lived on this earth. The historic evidence for a man named Jesus from Nazareth who actually lived on this planet is, overwhelming and incontrovertible. Everybody believes Jesus actually lived here. The question is twofold. Number one, was he who he said he was? And number two, when he died, what happened next? And we believe that when he died, he didn't stay there. That 3 days later, which we celebrate on Easter Sunday and every Sunday, he rose from the dead. And I try to do this every Easter, just very briefly, and then give you some resources, because I realize that probably many of us have friends or acquaintances that don't necessarily believe in the resurrection. And so let me just share with you 3 reasons why we can believe in it. This is just, moments of thought here. First, we have reliable historical documents from eyewitnesses. There are amazing numbers of historic documents of eyewitnesses who saw Jesus alive after the crucifixion. And the overwhelming number of them is significantly more than any eyewitness accounts of the Battle of Waterloo, any eyewitness accounts to the life of Aristotle or to the life of Julius Caesar. And the historic documentation that Jesus lived and that people saw him after he was dead, alive and well, is overwhelming. And to be intellectually honest, if you're going to accept that Napoleon was defeated at the Battle of Waterloo, there's more evidence that Jesus rose from the dead. And then, of course, we have those post-resurrection appearances. Paul lists some of them in 1 Corinthians 15. He appeared to Peter, and then the 12, and then more to 500 at the same time. Some people say, well, those appearances were just hallucinations. Well, you really don't have a group of 500 people all hallucinating the same hallucination all at the same time. And then he said it was James, and then the apostles, and then to me. But to me, one of the most telling things about the resurrection is that his enemies never contradicted the story that the tomb was empty. When Easter Sunday happened, the soldiers said, uh-oh, because remember, Pilate had put a guard there. The rule was, if you lose your prisoner, you give your life. Their prisoner's gone. He rose. He's not there. So what are we going to do now? And we're going to make up stories, that his disciples came and stole the body or whatever. But his enemies never said, if you come over here, y'all went to the wrong tomb. Here's where he is. They've never contradicted that the tomb was empty, and they've never produced any remains of Jesus. I remember one time a while back, they were so celebrating, and I forget which religious leader it was, but a religious leader of another religion. They found a fragment of his bone. And they were celebrating, yes, we found it. If they find a fragment of the bone of Jesus, we all go home, because it's over. But I don't lose any sleep about them trying to find a bone of Jesus. They've been trying for 2,000 years, hadn't found one yet. I talked to a Buddhist lady one time, and she said, I just don't believe he rose from the dead. And I said, well, where is he? And at least she was honest enough to admit, they haven't found him yet, but I just believe that somewhere over there in the Middle East, one of these days, they're going to find his body. Well, his enemies never contradicted the story of the empty tomb, and they have never, in over 2,000 years, yet produced his body. That's the fact of the resurrection. And I put in your notes section 4 different books from 4 different perspectives. If you have friends, and I would just suggest that you yourself read these. It would be of interest to you. Josh McDowell would do lectures on college campuses and kept being pushed. Tell us how you know about the resurrection. And he wrote the book, Evidence That Demands a Verdict. If there were one book to buy about the historic and legal documentation of the last days of Christ's life, I would suggest that you get that one. You can still get them. Frank Morrison was an attorney who was a skeptic. Some friends of him challenged him and said, why don't you look at the documentation about the resurrection and use legal standards? As an attorney, he was a courtroom attorney. What can you admit as evidence in a trial? Look at the evidence and see what you think. He became a Christian and wrote the book, Who Moved the Stone? Paul Little writes from a Christian perspective, Know Why You Believe, which is a series of, why you can defend the resurrection. Lee Strobel was an investigative journalist for one of the major Chicago newspapers and was confronted by some of his Christian friends. Why don't you approach the story of the resurrection of Christ as you do your investigative journalism articles? Investigate it, do the interviews, do the researches, look at the facts, look at the manuscripts. You do this the way you do your investigative journalism and see what you think. He became a follower of Christ and wrote The Case for Christ. So those are just 4, and there's a lot more out there. But there's 4, and they're from 4 different perspectives as to how we can be assured, intellectually honest about the resurrection. But following the fact of the resurrection comes the responsibility of the resurrection. It's interesting that as soon as the angel says he's alive, the angel says, you go tell his disciples. We understand, and I've said it all morning long, that the message of Easter is Jesus rose from the dead, but it's more than that. It's that his power is available for us today. That there's not only the resurrection fact, there's a resurrection principle of his power available at work. I read earlier the Ephesians 1 passage where Paul said, I want you to know the greatness of his power to you who believe. It's the same power that raised Christ from the dead. His resurrection power is the power that flows through His believers today, enabling and equipping us to face the challenges of our lives. God brings new life, and we have the responsibility and the privilege of telling people that good news, that God brings new life, that messed up lives can be fixed, that ruined lives can be restored, that Christ can make all things new. And we have the responsibility, and maybe a better word for that would have been the privilege of the resurrection, of going and telling others that Christ makes a difference in our lives. In verse 7, and this is where I want to focus the application lesson today, is the power of the resurrection. Go tell His disciples He's risen from the dead, and He's going ahead of you into Galilee. His daily involvement in our daily lives. For years, I missed that phrase, He is going ahead of you into Galilee. Children learn, and you may remember some of this, that often you find yourself in two different situations. Sometimes there's the me first situation. When the plate of cupcakes come out, me first. When the pony rides, in the line, me first. When, whatever it was, who wants to sit up front, me first. And there were those times when you wanted to be first. You wanted the biggest piece of the cake. You wanted the best seat in the car. Whatever it was, you wanted to go first. Me first. But then there were other situations where you didn't want to be first. And those were the you go ahead situations. Like, who wants the last of the cream spinach? You go ahead. Who's going to jump in the lake to see if it's warm enough to swim in? You go first. Who's going to go on the scary ride first, to make sure that it's okay? Which of the chemistry lab partners is going to smell the stuff first to see how bad it really is? You go first. Because if somebody else went first, we didn't have to risk looking foolish. We didn't have to risk, being afraid. We had a chance, if somebody else went first and they went ahead, we had a chance to watch their reactions and gauge whether or not we wanted to do that or if it was time for us to dip. And so we had those you go ahead situations, because there are times when it benefits if other people go ahead. I still remember this, and I don't do amusement rides. I just don't. I'll sit and let you ride as long as you want to ride. I'm not going to do that. The Lord put me on planet Earth to keep my feet on the ground. And so I remember one time, and it was Kimberly was young, still kind of a babe in arms, and we had gone somewhere, and there was an amusement park, and Kimberly was old enough where she said, I want to ride that. Some huge, like, pirate ship looking thing that just swung back and forth. I thought, well, that's not so bad. I can get on that with her. I'm holding her in my arms, and it starts to go back and forth, and then it stops. I think it's over. So I stand up with Kimberly in my arms, and it starts going the other way, much faster and much more intensely. And I quickly sat back down and put the bar around us, I still vividly remember what I felt. Oh man, I'm going to kill my baby. Ever since then, not only do I not go on rides, I sit and watch one all the way through before I allow anybody with me to go on the ride. Because I want to make sure that when it stops, it's not going to do something else to trick you, So you go ahead. If you go with me to Six Flags, you go ahead. I'm going to sit in the car. I've got my iPad, I've got my books. When you're done, knock yourselves out. You go ahead. We all know those you go ahead times. Well, I forgot to put the title of the sermon in your notes. But the title of the sermon for your notes, and you can write it in if you want to, is Our Go Ahead God. Because what Easter Sunday tells us is that God went ahead. He went first. He went first through temptation. He went first through suffering. He went first through betrayal. He went first through mocking. He went first through death. And he went all the way through to resurrection. He's gone first. So we can look at his life and say, you know, because he lives, I can face tomorrow. Life's worth living because he lives. He went first. He's our go-ahead God. And he went ahead through all of that and came out on the other side victoriously, which tells me that you and I can too. Why did he say he's going ahead of you into Galilee? Galilee is where the disciples were from. That was their home. And what Jesus is saying is, I'm going back to your home. You know, it's a lot easier to put on a Christian front when you're not home, you know, because people at home know you. You know, home can be one of the hardest places to live your faith sometimes. And what Jesus is saying, or what the angel is saying is, he's already at your home base, and he's already going to be there, and wherever you are, he's there. And last night as I was looking over this again, I jotted down over in the margin of my notes a poster, a little sign that's up in my office that says, don't be afraid of tomorrow. God is already there. You know, he's gone ahead of you into Galilee. This is even better than he's going to walk with you to Galilee. It's when you get to Galilee, you're going to find out he's there. Whatever your daily life throws at you, he has gone ahead of you into Galilee. But Galilee was also the place of the Great Commission. It was at Galilee where he said, now, you go into all the world and preach the gospel. In other words, that was the launching pad for their future ministry. And when God calls us to leave our Galilee and go to the othermost parts of the earth, we can know that he's been there too. That he's gone ahead of us when he calls us to serve him in new places with new people. He's already there waiting for us. When we face new challenges, he's already there. When we face new opportunities and new seasons of life, he's already there. But when you think about it, God's always been a go-ahead God. When Moses led the people out of the land of Egypt, you remember that a pillar of fire by night and a pillar of cloud by day went ahead of them. When the Israelites are struggling to gain a foothold in the promised land, God said the Ark of the Covenant, which is the symbol of God's presence, goes ahead of you when you go into battle. When the psalmist talks about God's presence in his life, he talks about the mighty arm of God that goes ahead of us. And when the women went to the tomb that first Easter to finish the embalming process of their dead friend, they didn't know God had gone ahead of them and he was raised from the dead. God has always been a go-ahead God. And the greatest go-ahead of all is Easter. He went ahead of us through the most horrific pain and suffering that anybody can go through. And he went ahead of us all the way through the tomb to the resurrection. And he will go ahead of us into each new day, into each new challenge, because he is our go-ahead God. And the promise of the resurrection is there you will see him. It's not just he's going to be there. You'll see him. You'll know that he's there. And don't miss the word there. Sometimes the reason we don't see God is because we're not where he told us to go. Yeah. He said, when you go to Galilee, you will see him there because he is there waiting on you. And that's the heart of Easter today, is that God has gone ahead of us into each new day, into each new challenge, into each new opportunity, into each new season of life. He has gone ahead of us. And he has given us the privilege of telling others that he'll be with them as well. Where is Galilee? Galilee is your daily life. Galilee is where you are, wherever it is that you are, wherever it is that God calls you to go. Galilee is your daily life. Galilee is home base. Galilee is, this is where God has put me. See, Jesus was not raised from the dead so that he could sit around a campfire with us and hold our hands and we could sing Kumbaya. Jesus rose from the dead so that we could face life with victory and triumph because of his resurrection power in our lives. Yes, life is filled with difficulties and challenges, but God has gone ahead of us, and he's there. And when you go where he sends you, you will find him there in all of his resurrection power, equipping and enabling you to be more than conquerors in your life, just as he was in his life. If you listen to Christian radio, you've probably heard Lauren Daigle's song, Trust in You. It's a great song. You need to look it up. You need to download it on iTunes or Google Play or wherever you get your music. It's worth $1.29 or whatever it is. There is a line in the first verse that says, you know what tomorrow brings. There's not a day ahead you have not seen. And the second verse says, there's not a place where I'll go that you've not already stood. And I listened to that about 5 or 6 times last night as I was working on this. Yeah, that's it. That's what resurrection is. He knows what tomorrow brings. He's already there. There's not a place that I'm going to go in my life that he's not already been there. He walks with me and he talks with me. But beyond that, he goes ahead and he faces it first. And he is waiting for us to show up where he told us to go with his resurrection power to flow through us. That's the good news. Yes, Jesus physically rose from the dead. That's the proof that he was the Son of God. Since he was the Son of God, that means that his death on the cross paid the price for our sins. And because he paid the price for our sins, we can be forgiven. We can have peace with God. We can have a new start. We can be assured of heaven when we die. We can be assured of a reunion coming with loved ones who know the Lord, who've gone on before us. All of that is only possible because Jesus rose from the dead. And because he lives, I can face tomorrow. And you can too, because he's gone ahead. And he's right there waiting on you with all the power that you need to be more than victorious in all of the challenges of life. Father, thank you for that good news. Thank you that Jesus is alive. And thank you that that same power rests in us today. So often we don't access it. So often we try to live life in our own power and in our own strength, and we usually mess it up and wonder why. But Lord, help us to leave this room today realizing that your resurrection power rests in us, and you've gone ahead of us, and you are waiting for us. And when we follow you in obedience, your power, your peace, your presence is going to be with us. And I thank you for that. So Lord, as we leave today, may we leave with our shoulders a little square and our head raised a little higher and our step a little peppier, because we've been reminded that Jesus is alive and his power rests in us. And now may the Lord bless you and keep you. May he make his face to shine on you and give you his peace now and evermore. Amen. God bless you. Thanks for coming out today. Happy Easter. You're dismissed.